Welcome to Before Emotion, a conference on conceptions of affectivity in pre-modern cultures. Now, that is something of a mouthful. So let me say a word on what we had in mind and what you may expect over the next 2 days. Never before, I think, have the emotions been so intensively studied as they are today. In addition to the various tools and concepts that were applied in the past, we now have highly refined instruments by which to track neural activity in the brain, to the point at which scientists have come close to localizing just where emotions are registered. All of us have been impressed by this research and have absorbed it into our thinking and approaches to the emotions to one degree or another. But as historians, accustomed to comparing and contrasting concepts, even the most basic, in different societies, a question naturally presented itself. Are the emotions uniform across culture? Is there even a concept of emotion in all languages, at all times and places, that is comparable to our own? If so, can we say that the emotions themselves have a history? Let me introduce the question indirectly for just a moment with the example of colors. We all see blue and red and white and black, or so we assume, subject to individual variations in optical sensitivity. And yet we know that color terminology may vary substantially from one language to another. We think of colors as occupying a place along a spectrum, but colors have many other properties such as brightness, think of matte versus enamel paints, tint and shade, and even more importantly, they have a relation to the natural world. Suppose instead of green or yellow or blue, we had words like grass-colored or sea-colored. Very useful, quite natural, but it would be difficult to map them easily onto our own terms. And this is exactly why scholars have had problems describing and defining ancient color terms. As it happens, for example, the Latin word for yellow, or more accurately, straw-colored, is flavus, and flavus is cognate with English blue. If this can happen in the realm of colors, why not expect it to be all the more likely in the case of emotions, which are less visible and more internal? Consider this case. Aristotle tells us that we can't be angry at someone whom we're afraid of. And what's more, we don't get angry at people who are afraid of us. Now, you may be thinking, as I first thought when I came across these claims, that Aristotle is just wrong. Of course, I can be angry with people I fear. In fact, it's quite likely that I will be. So what has happened is that, has Aristotle made a mistake? Not unexpected in a philosopher, perhaps? But then I reflected. Aristotle was not describing anger and its effects. He was describing orge, the Greek word we conventionally translate as anger. What if orge had somewhat different connotations than our anger, and that if we consider the way Aristotle defined it, his conclusions would follow quite logically? And that turned out to be the case, as I and others have concluded. But if so, then did the ancient Greeks feel the same emotion that we do when something upset them? Could anger really be deeply different in one culture and another? Is it not a universal human sentiment here, Greece, everywhere? These are the kinds of problems that we historians of culture wrestle with, and there's no final answer, not yet, and I expect not in the near or distant future. No final answer. Some affects must be common to us all. Otherwise, how would people from different cultures understand each other and recognize their feelings? And yet there are differences, and important ones. And from this, another question arises. If neuroscientists are busy discovering the exact locus or loci in the brain where anger is registered, are these also the places where ancient Greek orge was located? After all, Greek orge, it seems, doesn't map perfectly onto our anger. Why then should the neural activity be the same for the two, any more than we would expect it to be the same for, let's say, anger and fear? We have been raising these questions, and in fact, the neuroscientists have been listening. Okay, let's grant that anger or shame or even fear might assume somewhat different forms and expressions in different cultures. But whatever their terminology and their lived experience, they would surely group anger, fear, pity, shame, love, hate, envy, and all those under one umbrella concept, and that would be emotion. But again, do these terms indeed form a natural set? Is shame really so analogous to love? Wouldn't it make as much sense to group love, let's say, with desire, and maybe shame with anxiety, and thereby construct two classes, not just emotion, but let's say one class called wishing and one class called withdrawal? And if we did, perhaps we wouldn't even have the need for an overarching concept like emotion that would cover the whole range. Maybe there is no such thing as an emotion faculty in our psyches, but a different kind or different kinds of division. And so we arrive not just at the question of how emotions may differ then and now, but whether there was a time before emotion, the topic of our investigation today and tomorrow. And to this effect, we will hear, as Matthew pointed out, over the next 2 days, discussions of emotions by experts in classical Greek, Latin, Chinese, Pali and Sanskrit, Arabic and Hebrew, and we will learn how emotions and the very idea of emotion were conceived in these several traditions. This is, I think, the first such colloquium to address this question across so many linguistic traditions, and we hope to add more at some future date. But you are surely eager now to hear from our experts, and so let me introduce the first of our speakers, Pia Campeggiani. Pia Campeggiani is Associate Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Bologna. She has published widely on the philosophy and history of emotion. Personally, I'm proud to say that she and I have published 2 articles jointly. Her first book was on anger in ancient Greece, Le ragioni dell'ira, potere e riconoscimento nell'antica Grecia. Her latest book, you'll recognize this more easily, is called Theories of Emotion, Expressing, Feeling, Acting, and it's about to appear, published by Bloomsbury Press. The book covers modern theories generally and is without a doubt the best introduction to the subject that I know. Pia will speak to us about emotions and emotion in classical Greece. Pia.
Thank you so much, David, for your generous introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Maura, for assisting us so thoroughly over these days, to guiding us through the mysteries of Zoom. So here we are, and I'll try to share my screen because I've prepared some slides. What's this? Okay. I'm going to focus on Aristotle today rather than the entire ancient Greek culture in its entirety, and I'm going to well, this is how the story will unfold. So I'm actually going to start with some remarks on the crucial issue that is currently discussed in contemporary emotion theory, and that has to do with the epistemological status of emotion concepts and terms, both of the term emotion and individual emotion terms such as anger, fear, happiness, and so on. Then I will go on, proceed with Aristotle, and I would like to introduce you to the main features of his project, as a student of emotion. And finally, I should like to conclude by saying something about what I think Aristotle can do for us. So in what ways we could make use of Aristotle's work on emotion to deal with some challenges that are still open in contemporary emotion debate. So I shall start by referring to this paper by James Russell from a psychological constructionist perspective, because here, as he does elsewhere, James Russell makes a very important point, a point about which there is, as of today, widespread agreement in contemporary affective science. And the point is that fear, anger, happiness, and the like are folk concepts. And that of emotion itself is a folk concept. This basically means that these words are words that we use in ordinary language in daily life. They bring with them a lot of intellectual, cultural, religious, philosophical implications. They are culturally specific, they shift historically, And we should be aware that they are so. And I'll say something more in a moment, but it wasn't always the case that these emotion terms and the concepts they refer to were recognized as folk concepts and folk terms. There has been an important period in the history of emotion research where these terms were used as scientific terms, or to refer as to scientific phenomena. So I'll say something more in a second. I would like to add that Jim Russell, together with Beverly Fair, in a very fine paper published in 1984, has produced further interesting work on anger, fear, love, and the like as folk concepts. And they have recognized these concepts as basic level concepts. By basic, they meant conceptually basic in the sense that Eleanor Roche introduced in the debate in the 70s. So Eleanor Roche was a psychologist, and she has shown that basic level concepts afford wide variety of cognitive tasks in the most economic way. So for example, at the level of dog, as opposed to mammal or animal, or downwards to collie. At the level of dog, we form very easily a representative image of what we're talking about. Basic level concepts are named more quickly by adults. So if you ask adults to name 6 emotions, they will come up most likely with basic level terms like anger, love, fear, and so on. The names we use to denote basic level concepts are usually very short, and those are the first one that we teach children and that children learn, and so on. So this basic level is the most inclusive one, of which there are attributes that are common to all or most members of a category, as opposed to what happens to the superordinate level, which is more abstract and therefore more inclusive, and the subordinate level, which is more specific. Right, so here you can see an example with the emotion of anger as a basic level concept. So the point I want to make here is that conceptual basicness of this kind is altogether different from biological basicness. And accordingly, the use of ordinary language terms to denote biologically basic phenomena, as Paul Ekman, for example, has done, has been widely criticized. So here you see 2 quotations from 2 of the most well-known critics of Paul Ekman version of basic emotion theories, Panksepp and Russell, and both of them claim they are deeply concerned about the use of folk terms in affective science, that folk psychological words are not good scientific labels. Panksepp is also a basic emotion theorist of a kind, but he capitalizes the words he used to make sure that people understand he's not talking about, when he talks of anger or lust or fear, he doesn't mean what we mean in ordinary language in our daily life. So this was the first point that I wanted to emphasize before entering discussion of Aristotle's theory of emotion. The second point is about the way we categorize items. So there is widespread agreement also on the fact that emotion categories, both the category of emotion and individual categories like anger, fear, happiness, love, etc., are not out categories. So they are not categories understood, construed in the classical way with reference to a set of properties that are shared by each of its members and that each of the members possesses for intrinsic reasons, but they are rather radial categories. So they have fuzzy boundaries. The conditions for memberships are flexible. There are best examples, what are called prototypes, less good examples, peripheral cases, borderline cases, and so on. And the members of these categories are grouped based on what Wittgenstein has famously called family resemblances, defining it as a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. So family resemblances are a matter of degree. They depend on a number of variables. For example, I don't know, it could be statistical frequencies or the salience of a given goal or individual experience, what we're used to, these kind of things. And in the case of emotion, familiar resemblances are based on what are usually called scripts or mini narratives that involve a number of aspects of an experience. I mean, if an experience shows enough of these aspects, is categorized as emotional. So I'll give you an example, the example of the prototypical case of fear, right? So fear, in the prototypical case of fear, I suddenly become aware that something is threatening me. I experience physiological alterations, most typically pillow erection, heart rate acceleration. My hearing becomes more acute. If I'm hungry, I stop feeling hungry. If I felt pain somewhere, that pain is very much reduced as I start looking for a way to escape from danger. And eventually I flee if I'm successful. So this is the prototypical narrative of fear. And as you can see, it ties prototypical beliefs, there's danger, something is threatening me, to prototypical action goals, I need to escape. It includes prototypical causes. I don't know, in the case of fear, well, danger is a cause, and we might interpret its presence in different ways in the environment. Prototypical feelings, so if I might feel my heartbeat accelerating, for example, facial expressions, actions, and so on. So what is interesting is that none of these elements is necessary for any one particular experience to be construed as fear. There will be best examples, prototypical cases of fear that conform to this narrative, and other cases that will be borderline or peripheral, but that we still understand or classify as fear in our ordinary communication. So what is important is that it's not so much the single items that constitute the narrative that are relevant here, but the pattern, the co-occurrence of these different elements together that makes this case prototypical. Okay, so this then was the second point. First point, emotion concepts are folk concepts, and second point, emotion categories, including the category of emotion itself, are radial. So they have a flexible internal structure and fuzzy boundaries. And this is, of course, true of psychology, and so it is true of the way we understand and talk about our emotions. But I think what is most interesting, or more interesting still, is that a similar approach is appropriate also when it comes to the scientific concept of emotion. That is, to emotion investigated as having an evolutionary origin and distinctive biological markers. In the context of the scientific study of emotion, essentialist theories have been successfully replaced by more liberal theories, such as that of Boyd, homeostatic property clusters theory. Here, what I have in mind, what I'm making reference to, is mainly the work of Andreas Carantino, who is a very well-known philosopher of emotion, a leading scholar in emotion studies, and is based in the US. So he has worked with Boyd, homeostatic property cluster theory of natural kinds. And the idea here is that if a set of properties clustered together more or less reliably because of one or more causal homeostatic mechanisms, then the objects that exhibit this cluster of properties are members of an homeostatic property cluster's natural kind. So how does it apply to the scientific concept of emotion? Well, the scientific concept of emotion includes only a subset of the many and highly heterogeneous members of folk emotion categories. It refers to coordinated patterns of physiological alterations, subjective experiences, motor patterns, modulation of cognitive processes such as attention, memory, imagination, and so on, that were selected to orchestrate responses to recurrent evolutionary problems. So in the light of homeostatic property cluster theory of natural kinds, the scientific concept of emotion can be revised and can accommodate, as Andreas Carantino has shown very well, a high degree of variability, because no cluster properties are individually necessary. And this variability, of course, makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary viewpoint, because surviving requires flexible rather than rigid responses. So the universal fingerprint, so to say, here is not so much a correlation between an emotion and neural mechanism, because we know that doesn't exist. So that's an idea scientists had at some point, but there is evidence against it. There is no one-to-one correlation between what happens in the brain and what we call fear, anger, and so on. The fingerprint, what is really universal, is the motivational structure, the functional structure. So fear is about trying to escape a danger. Anger is about trying to remove an obstacle. But then the output, the way we behave out of this emotion, will be contingent on stimuli. It will depend on what's actually going on. And the mechanisms from a neural viewpoint that underlie these experiences are multiple and can differ from one to time very significantly. Right? Okay. So let's turn now to Aristotle. And if we turn to his work, we will see that there is space. He has the conceptual tools that are necessary to conceptualize prototypical meaning, focal meaning, or primary nuclear sense, the thing we were talking about before. So he has the conceptual tools to categorize items based on prototypes, best examples, worse examples, less good examples, peripheral cases, and so on. In the Metaphysics in Book 4, he talks about the fact that homonyms are ordered around a core meaning. So a central meaning, a central point around which a number of different terms float, and they can be nearer to the core meaning or further from the core meaning, but they still belong to the same group. So this happens with the word pathos and pathe, which is the Greek word which is typically translated as, not only, but typically translated as emotion and emotions. So in Aristotle, pathe are, first of all, can be very, the word can have a very general meaning. The very general meaning of just happenings, experiences, anything that affects and modifies something, including, for example, stylistic variations. So he talks of pathe as lexeos in the Poetics, for example. But then, of course, he also has a narrower category of pathe, what he calls pathe of the soul, which are affections experienced by all living organisms, all living things. And these include sense perceptions, include what we call emotions, appetites, desires, and even reasonings, as you can see from this quotation I put on the slide for you from the Anima, which is Aristotle's psychological treatise on the soul. And on some occasions, most famously in the Rhetoric, Aristotle uses pathe in a very, very similar sense to our folk psychological ordinary language concept, emotions, as is clear from the list of examples that he provides and discusses in Book 2 of the Rhetoric. So here, Aristotle looks at pathe as emotions, as experiences on whose account people change and differ with regard to their judgments, and that entail pain and pleasure. And he adds that this is the case, for example, of anger, pity, fear, and the like, with their opposites. And the entire second book of the Rhetoric is dedicated to the discussion of these emotions and others, including calmness, friendship, hatred, shame, gratitude, and more. So here in the Rhetoric, Aristotle works with the meaning that emotion terms have in everyday discourse, and he describes the basic level narratives that constitute our prototypical examples of anger, pity, envy, and so on. So that's what he does. That's what he's interested in. But that's not the only thing he does. So as contemporary students of emotion, as I said, use the term emotion to cover much more than the folk psychological category of emotion, well, Aristotle did the same. So Aristotle used the same words, affect, and specific emotion terms such as fear, pity, jealousy, and so on, to apply, well, both for emotions in the context of his folk emotion project, so to call it, and in the context of his scientific emotion project. So when he studied emotions in biology, in biological psychology, and in ethology. So he believed, from a biological viewpoint, that emotions come about as alterations of the temperature of the body. For example, fear comes with cooling, and heat, on the other hand, is the effect of spirit, of thumos, which is sometimes also translated as anger. And Aristotle believes that emotions motivate animals to move towards what they desire and away from what they dislike. So they perform a motivating function, which is their biological function in Aristotle's view, because they come about as thermal alterations. He thinks that organisms experience thermal alterations subjectively as feelings of pleasure or pain. What an animal perceives as pleasant, it pursues, and what an animal perceives or imagines or thinks about as painful, this animal will avoid. So we shouldn't be surprised to find the same words in contexts so different as these. In one case, it's dealing with human beings in the rhetoric, and in another is dealing with octopuses or dolphins, like in the Historia Animalium. But he's looking at this phenomenon from a continuous viewpoint. And this brings us to the last part of my talk, with which I will conclude if I still have some time, which is about what Aristotle can do for us, because I think some of his insights could really be very helpful for contemporary students of emotions, especially to deal with the biggest challenge that I think is still open in debate, which is how to explain, how to integrate the psychological and social cultural accounts with the biological accounts of emotion. So the most important things, the most interesting things that I find in Aristotle's emotion theory have to do with the continuity between the primary affective states that Aristotle studies in his biology and his ethology, and the more sophisticated emotional experiences that human beings talk about. And I think with Aristotle, we witness an attempt to explain how experiences requiring highly complex cognitive abilities, such as those he discusses in the rhetoric, relate to the basic patterns of activation to deal with fundamental life tasks that are typical of all living and minimally sentient organisms. So if we go with Aristotle this way, then we will be taken beyond the distinction between cognition and affectivity. We will understand emotions as balanced experiences, as he does, so as experiences that are pleasant, or painful, or both. So he's very clear about that. Emotions are ways of experiencing pleasure and pain. These feelings of pleasure and pains derive from bodily changes and states, and therefore these bodily changes and states are already endowed with meaning. They are already meaning producing, meaning making. And Aristotle sees this as the biological function of emotion. In modern terms, we could say that emotions perform their motivating function by virtue of their element of what we call balance. So they're being pleasant, painful, or mixed, both pleasurable and painful. So affective valence, which is the pleasure and the pain that arises from heating and chilling processes in the body, according to Aristotle, amounts to sensation that an animal feels. And by virtue of these feelings of pleasure and pain, the animal is motivated to movement and to action. And indeed, emotions for Aristotle are not just reactions, but are actions. And this brings us beyond the input-output model, so-called. So emotions are not just reactions to the information that an agent picks up from the external world, but operate as goal-oriented means of exploring the environment. And because our affective states underpin our evaluations, as Aristotle is very clear, this is the case in the rhetoric, for example, emotions play a significant role in the way we construe what's going on. And therefore, they create new action possibilities that make some courses of actions more salient and more urgent for us than others. But of course, Aristotle also knows that the agent is not the only source of behavior. There is constant traffic between the agent and the world. The material and the social environment is not just there to receive our actions, but it also contributes to making them possible or impossible, more or less urgent, and so on. And this then again takes us beyond the divide between organism and environment. And it helps us see that emotions are balanced, embodied appraisals, are actions, but they're also interactions. And so these three elements, I think, are the most important insights that we should treasure from Aristotle philosophy. Well, thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful overview of what modern theories of emotion are like, and just the interpretation of emotions as multidimensional, containing various components that are not all necessarily present at any given time, and that allows for the great variety that we see of emotions across cultures, and making us aware once again that Aristotle was prescient in being able to see these emotions in these complex ways, and is one of the reasons why modern scholars of emotion theory, not just classicists, have seen in Aristotle a forerunner or even a fellow researcher in these problems and the interpretation of emotions. And I'm now going to take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who is Curie Virág. Curie is a specialist in the philosophy and intellectual history of early and middle period China, working on ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology, especially in relation to the emotions. Let me add that she is also co-organizer of this present conference, and she and I have been in constant interaction and communication in deciding every aspect of it. She's the author of The Emotions in Early Chinese Philosophy, which appeared in 2017, and is working now on a second monograph, tentatively titled Emotional Worlds, Self, Community, and Cosmos in Medieval China. She's currently based at the University of Edinburgh, where she's a senior researcher and co-director of a project on cross-cultural and interdisciplinary research funded by the European Research Council, and her co-edited volume with Douglas Cairns, In the Mind, in the Body, and in the World, Emotions in Early China and Ancient Greece, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. So let me introduce to you now, Curie. Curie, would you tune in and say hello?
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much, David, for the kind introduction and for the brilliant idea to have this event. I'm very happy to be taking part and just to have this. It's actually been an extended conversation over months with this wonderful group of scholars, and I've learned a lot so far. So it's been great to be involved. Thank you also to the NYU Center for Asian Studies, Matthew and Maura, for sponsoring and hosting this event. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and hopefully it will, okay, wait. Okay, so my contribution to our shared topic is to offer some observations about what might be some of the distinctive features of the conceptualization of emotions in early China. Now, this is obviously a huge question, and much of what I wrote in my book, The Emotions in Early Chinese Philosophy, was a kind of extended engagement with this very question. What I'd like to do today is to focus on what kinds of questions we pose when we set about investigating the emotions. And I think this is something that we will notice when we discuss how the conceptualization of emotions plays out in so many different traditions. I'm interested in how the questions we pose affect what we pay attention to when we are investigating emotions in the past, and can ultimately impact what we think emotions are ultimately about. So I will focus on a set of key texts from the early philosophical tradition, sort of the obvious text, right? But I think there's so much we can still do to reconstruct what's going on. So the Analects of Confucius, Mencius, Shunzi, and Mozi, as well as a text called the Lu Shi Chen Qiu, which is usually translated as the Annals of Lu Buwei, which was composed in the 3rd century BC in the court of the Qin state in the years leading to the formation of the First Empire. The political context is very important. I won't talk about it, but I think you'll notice the political implications are pretty strong. So normally when we investigate a topic, any topic, it's a fairly standard procedure to go straight for the bullseye, right? And to pursue a definition. So in our case, what is an emotion? Now, William James famously posed this question in his article of 1884 in Mind, where he inverted previous conceptions of emotions by as sort of beginning in the mind's perception and giving rise to bodily changes. Right? So he inverts that and argues that emotion is the feeling of these bodily changes. Now, the idea that emotions are mental perceptions or bodily events are but just a few of a plethora of accounts that have been forwarded as to what an emotion is. Ronald D'Souza, in his book Emotional Truth, published in 2011, has amassed no fewer than 29 accounts, and these are just modern accounts. And if you include all those that came before and all those that came after 2011, we end up with a fairly hefty list. Now, however you choose to answer this question, many modern scholars take for granted that the question is transparent, right, and straightforward, and one that has to be dealt with directly and often empirically through an analysis of the phenomenon itself. And it's this transparency, the transparency of the question and of what it means to answer the question that I'd like to unsettle today. So I'd like to focus on how our ways of answering this question are bound up with very specific assumptions about both the object of inquiry as well as the methods of investigation. And I'd like to orient these approaches to the more foundational question that might have occupied thinkers in the past and probably thinkers in the present as well, namely, what is it to be human and what can the investigation of emotions tell us about the human condition? Now, when William James posed the question, what is an emotion? He was presumably taking part in a long tradition of scientific investigation going all the way back to the Greeks. The one that assumes that investigating something involves an analytical procedure that takes us to the components of the thing itself, the constituent components of the thing itself. Now, this is a very particular sort of procedure. In his book, Adversaries and Authorities, Geoffrey Lloyd emphasizes the specificity of methods of investigation in ancient Greek and Chinese scientific cultures. And he observes that when you're talking about, when you're trying to compare different traditions, you can't simply proceed as though everyone's talking about the same thing, right? Nor can we assume that the questions they were asking were the same ones that we today are asking. So instead, he stresses, we need to ask what the questions were to which the answers were thought to be the right answers. Now, Lloyd further observes that the Greeks, for various historical reasons, deployed a particular investigative style in answering these questions, namely one that involved breaking things down to their constituent elements. That is, in effect, what gives us elements theory. But why proceed in this way? And so he asks why the issue is, did the Greeks so often focus on the question of the underlying elements to which they gave so many divergent answers? Why this preoccupation with the simplest units to which everything else can be reduced, with what is in itself unchanging, but is itself the ground of change with foundations? Viewed from this angle, the modern sciences of emotions, or even pre-modern sciences of emotions, look like a kind of elements theory about the human being, right? An interrogation of the constituent elements of the psyche or the soul of the person. In early Chinese sources, we find a somewhat different way of mapping what it is to be human and what an investigation of emotions can tell us about the human condition. The focus is not so much on emotions as components of the human being as on how they tie us to each other and form the basis of our connectedness with other beings. So if we consider the conceptual work, right, that emotions do in these sources, we might reconstruct a somewhat different order of question, one that better reflects why thinkers in China were interested in emotions, namely, how do emotions connect? So this attention to how our affective engagements furnish the ground of connectivity with the broader world presents us with a quite different way of framing the problem of emotions, one that brings to the foreground issues of space, scale, and structure. So I will now trace how this develops in a succession of major early texts from Confucius to the Annals of Lu Buwei, showing how through the shifting vocabulary of emotions, different constellations and configurations of emotion terms, the discourse of emotions is mobilized as a connective force that links individuals with other beings, animate or inanimate, and even with the cosmos itself. And given the shortness of time, I'll be providing something like a whirlwind tour of a bunch of thinkers, but I hope it does give you a sense of why it is that studying emotions in these texts involves different kinds of tools and procedures from what we're normally using. So I will focus on what I call 3 scales of spaces that emotions occupy. These represent sort of increments on a spectrum rather than strictly delineated phases. And while they move in the direction of increasing scale, this isn't an inexorable movement towards expansion. Pretty much at the end of the period that I will focus on today, we see a kind of retreat into the individual and the whole thing gets reconfigured. But I won't get into that. That's what I'm working on in my second book. So you can check back with me about that, the aftermath. So the 3 scales are first the localized affective community of ritualized interaction. Second is the universal community of human beings, the very idea of human beings, right, as part of a common species. And third, the resonant cosmos, where the entire cosmos is pervaded with affectivity. So the first, the affective community, the localized affective community of ritualized interaction. The example I'd like to give is Confucius. So Confucius is traditionally recognized as the founding figure of what is known as the Confucian tradition. And a hallmark of this tradition, as far as emotions are concerned, according to me, is a shared assumption that the proper fulfillment of emotions and desires is basic to what it means to be a fully realized person, and that the proper workings of emotions could furnish the guide for right action. So it's a vision that very much relies on a trajectory of self-cultivation, pretty much over one's entire life. So this fulfillment was understood as taking part in a community, but as you'll see, the scale of that community varied quite dramatically. So the Analects, which is sort of supposed to be a document of the events and conversations of Confucius, is quite full of references to what we would recognize as emotions. The very opening passage of the text is about the joy and delight accompanying a life of learning and enriched with friendship. To learn and then have occasion to put it into practice, is this not a joy? To have friends arrive from afar, is this not a delight? To be indignant when not recognized by others, is this not the mark of a gentleman? So in addition to these, there are discussions of quite a few specific emotions, such as love, shame, anxiety, grief, fear, resentment, contempt. There's also a great deal of discussion of affective virtues, so moral virtues that involve kind of having proper attitude and feeling. Probably the most important of these would be humaneness, filiality, and reverence. And here the discussion very much, the emphasis is very much on authenticity of feeling, which suggests the primacy of cultivating affective bonds with others, right, as a crucial part of what it means to be naturalized, a fully actualized person. So notably, Confucius is concerned with kinship ties between family members and members of the broader affective community. So we're dealing with a fairly localized scale that involves face-to-face interaction among members who live kind of in proximity with one another and mediated through the performance of ritual that is meant to embody and give form to affective virtues. These obligations do not really apply equally across the board to what we might call a universal community. Right? Confucius is very much a proponent of taking care of one's own. And this we can see in the following passage about sheep. So the Duke of Shi said to Confucius, "Among my people, there is one we call upright Gong. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities." Confucius replied, "Among my people, those who we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness is to be found in this." So for Confucius, our moral obligations, in our moral obligations, we should prioritize those with whom we have personal relationships. So to members of our family and to our local communities. And it's insofar as we perfect these affective relationships that one achieves sort of his vision of the ethical ideal. Now, the second scale is the universal community of human beings. And I think any number of third century thinkers would easily fall under this, but I focus on Mozi, Mencius, and Xunzi. So Mozi is known as the first major critic of Confucius and the whole Confucian system of values, which is premised, as you've seen, on the kinds of personal connections that Mozi thinks actually undermines the good of society as a whole. We can see these concerns in Mozi's famous doctrine of jian-ai, or impartial caring, as a response to the inhumane and violent world that he sees around him. According to Mozi, all the calamities of the world, right, warfare, famine, misery, poverty, corruption in the government, it could be traced back to the basic human tendency towards partiality. People were dispositionally inclined to benefit themselves at the expense of others, and to benefit one's own at the expense of those outside of one's affective community. They tended to pursue their own pleasure and profits rather than act in the interest of society as a whole. So unlike Confucius, who was committed to taking care of those in his in-group, Mozi gave voice through his idea of impartial caring, the idea that we have obligations to all people, to human beings as a universal category. He thus advocated that people be heaven-like in their caring. The character of heaven, Mozi explains, is to be broad and comprehensive. Its activities are all-encompassing and impartial. Its blessings are generous and unceasing. And its intelligence is constant and undiminishing. So as Mozi explains it, to practice impartial caring is to regard the state of others as one's own state, the families of others as one's own family, and the persons of others as one's own person, the houses of others as one's own, the persons of others as oneself. So by extending our affections outward towards all people, our partial and self-destructive tendency to care only about ourselves can be transformed into an impartial caring that benefits the world. So according to Mozi then, what makes us truly human is our capacity to not only care about people that we naturally would care about, but the capacity to care about people we don't even know, right? People who are part of a broader human community. So in forwarding this kind of solution, Mozi was proposing also that we envision ourselves as members of a broader collectivity that is linked in a web of interdependence. Now, moving on to Mencius, who was the most influential latter-day follower of Confucius, Mencius is most widely known for his claim about the goodness of human nature. And by this, he meant that we all possessed, by virtue of our biological endowment, a propensity for goodness that was rooted in certain dispositional tendencies. And this is his famous theory of the 4 sprouts. So the most important of these was the idea that every human being possessed what he called a mind that feels pity and compassion. As he explains in his famous thought experiment of the child about to fall into the well. So the mind that feels pity and compassion would be triggered by this sight. Now, not all people would necessarily act upon this feeling, right? But everyone, he says, everyone whose moral capacities are working properly or working normally, right, felt it, even if it was just a matter of the faintest twinge of regret. So the fact that they felt this twinge was sufficient, according to Mencius, for making the case that no one is devoid of a mind that is sensitive to the suffering of others. Now, in addition to these feelings of pity and compassion, there were 3 other inclinations that Mencius regarded as innately human. So shame and aversion, courtesy and respect, and a sense of right and wrong. And you'll see this is kind of a curious list, right? It's an interesting list within which items that we consider as emotions fall in, but it's not a list of emotions as we would construe it. So in attributing morally inclined propensities to our inborn nature, Mencius proposed that there were certain affective dispositions that all normally functioning people possessed by virtue of being human. Human beings, he says, have these 4 sprouts, just as they have 4 limbs. For one to have these 4 sprouts and yet to say of oneself that one is unable to fulfill them is to cripple oneself. So not all people would be able to cultivate these sprouts or even make the choice to cultivate these sprouts. But the capacity to do so was something that we all possessed by virtue of our biology. So in many ways, Mencius's account was diametrically opposed to that of Mozi, who thought that we had to overcome our spontaneous inclinations and cultivate an impartial caring for all people. But what is really striking is the way in which Mencius too relies on an account of the proper channeling of emotions to ground this idea of human beings as a universal category. Now, finally, a few words about Mencius, who was perhaps the second most influential latter-day follower of Xunzi, the second most influential follower of Confucius after Mencius. So Xunzi had a great deal to say about emotions. He probably had the most to say about emotions among all the warring states thinkers, certainly the most complex and interesting account of the emotions. I'm just going to focus on one issue here, which is that it is in Xunzi that we find a proposal for a term that is deployed as a blanket category for the various feelings, namely the term qing, right? Qing is often translated as emotion, but it's a difficult kind of mapping because the semantic range of the term is quite different from our modern term or even the Greek term pathe. But we can see this kind of, at least the notion of qing as some kind of collective category. There are a couple of passages, one in chapter 22, where Xunzi says the feelings of liking, disliking, joy, anger, sadness, and delight in one's nature are called qing, right? Another passage is in his Discourse on Heaven chapter, where he introduces the concept of tianqing, or heavenly feeling, a heavenly disposition. And heaven here is often taken as nature. So it's about sort of heaven endowed or natural dispositions. So when the work of heaven has been established and the accomplishments of heaven have been completed, then the body is set and spirit arises. Liking, disliking, happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy are contained therein. These are called one's heavenly dispositions. Now, it is because qing came to mean something like the category of emotions that the term has been of such great interest for modern scholars. But I should point out that the term qing is semantically quite different from the word emotion. It originally referred to something like the underlying genuine reality of something, right? The actual situation. And when thinkers began to use the term in reference to human beings, it seems to have progressed to something like a category of emotion, and eventually also to affection, love, and passion. So it has quite an expansive range. Now, the interest for scholars has been precisely that here we finally have, right? They're waiting for this moment. We finally have in Chinese sources a category for emotions. But as I've been trying to emphasize here, I don't think that's necessarily the key issue, or certainly not the only issue to be focusing on. And in the line of inquiry that I've been tracing, Xunzi's proposal of Qing as a collective category for emotion is part of an argument that other thinkers from the 5th century onwards were making, which is that there is a collective category of humans. So we can see this concern in the following passage, in which Xunzi elaborates on Qing as the natural disposition of human beings to desire satisfaction, essential satisfaction. So Xunzi writes, all people share one thing in common. When hungry, they desire to eat. When cold, they desire warmth. When tired, they desire rest. They like what is beneficial and hate what is harmful. This is something people have from birth. It is not something one awaits to become so. So this crucial expression here, Fanren, right, all people, is quite striking. So the emergence of the category of Qing, right, this unifying category for emotions, goes hand in hand with the emergence of the very idea of the human being as a natural category. So the third scale, the resonant cosmos, is something that we see in quite a number of texts. From the mid-3rd century BC and throughout the Qin and Han imperial periods, the emotions seem to be everywhere. They travel in and out of bodies and across vast distances of time and space. They connect people through channels of psychic communication and mutual transformation. And these connections are physical, right? They're physical and spiritual at the same time, and they link individuals together in a kind of dynamic of what's described as stirring and response, right? And we find this account in many different texts and genres. And so early imperial texts are filled with stories of people who are separated by vast distances, but are still physically linked through emotional bonds. So it points to a vision of a cosmos that is sort of interconnected, right? In this all-encompassing web of sympathetic resonance. And so more than feelings, right, or embodied mental and affective states, they spill out beyond the boundaries of the individual, and they're caught up in this traffic of swirling forces that link humans to each other and to other beings and to the larger world. So emotions become sort of cosmic forces that animate the world and link people together. In the Annals of Lu Buwei, we find the argument that there is a single natural law at work in the world, and this is embodied in this notion Qing, right? So there's a chapter called On Emotions and Desires, and in that chapter we see the following passage. Heaven and earth are incapable of operating according to two principles. How much less then can humans? Humans are the same as heaven and earth in this respect. Although in their form, the myriad things are diverse, in their underlying inclinations or dispositions, Qing, they are one body. Thus, in governing themselves and the world, the ancients modeled themselves after heaven and earth. So Qing is the common denominator of all beings, from the sage rulers to the degenerate tyrants, from the noble to the base, and it's what unites everyone into a single collective category. But it's also what comprises the shared substance or body of the entire cosmic order. Now, in addition to this claim that all things are interlinked through Qing, we also find the idea that emotions are physical forces that link people through time and space. And the prime example of such connectivity is the bond between parents and child. It's a wonderful passage. I'm going to read the whole thing, even though it's quite long. And I think those of you who are parents, like I am, might be able to kind of relate to this notion. So in the passage it states, thus the relationship of parents to children and children to parents is like two halves of a single body, or different exhalations of a single breath. They're like parents that, like plants that spring from the same fruit, or trees that grow from the same root. Though they are in different places, they remain in communication with each other. If one has a hidden aspiration, it will reach the other. If one is suffering pain, the other will help. If one has anxieties and longings, the other is moved. If one is thriving, the other is happy. If one dies, the other is saddened. This is what being flesh and bone relatives means. The spirit that comes forth from such loyal devotion is echoed in the heart of the other. When the refined essence of each of them can reach one another, what need is there for words? So such possibility of bridging vast distances between individuals through shared, what is effectively shared chi. Right? It represents an extraordinary case for the connectivity and unity of human beings, as well as the connectivity to the entire cosmos. So I've presented a fairly streamlined and simple narrative of what I see as a key feature of evolving discourses of emotions in some central early Chinese texts, pointing towards a striking shifting of scales. And this reveals a highly spatialized way of thinking that was prevalent in early Chinese thought more generally, and that played out in the discourse of emotions. The ongoing debate about emotions was very much about its role in establishing the legitimacy of different ways of defining the boundaries of our concern. To whom are we obligated? With whom do we identify? What is the proper sphere of our concern, attention, and meaningful action? So it is in this sense that emotions might be thought of as webs of connectivity that establish and give form to our connections to other people and to the world. Such an idea has important implications for the kinds of emotions we should cultivate and the kinds of moral obligations we have towards one another. And so it points to an alternative account of what it is to be human. One is not born human, one becomes human through how one cultivates oneself and acts in the world. Now, in the end, I don't want to say that Western discourse or Greek discourse is all about elements theory and the Chinese is all about connectivity. I think these are sort of investigative styles and sites of attention that we find in different traditions. While I've definitely highlighted differences and downplayed commonalities, I don't want to present them in a deterministic way. I do think, though, that our best bet in ensuring that the cross-cultural study of topics like emotions can actually be productive is by doing more reconstruction and retrieval that bypasses modern approaches that have shaped the study of all cultural traditions for centuries, and that can identify the sorts of concerns and explanatory contexts that shaped how thinkers in different traditions approached the basic topics of inquiry like the emotions. Doing so can provide us with a richer and more varied repertoire that we can all draw from in our efforts to make sense of what it is to be human and of what the emotions has to do with this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Curie. It was, it couldn't be clearer that, as you put it, answers depend on the questions you ask. And when you ask questions about emotions, it is clear that in different contexts, probably even within a given society, and certainly across societies, the questions will look different. And what emotions mean and how they are conceived and constructed will also reflect the way the questions are posed. And now, thanks very, very much, Curie. I'm going to introduce our final speaker for this afternoon, and that is Nancy Khalek, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and History at Brown University. And she specializes in medieval Islam. She's the author of Damascus After the Muslim Conquest, Text and Image in Early Islam. Nancy's scholarship has focused on Islamic history, historiography, and material culture. And she's currently working on a book on the history of emotions and medieval and the medieval Islamic literary tradition. I would want to point out here that as a consequence of the conference that Matthew mentioned, we became aware that the studies of the history of emotions in the Arabic and Islamic traditions is still a very new field. And I can imagine that many of us, myself included, are eagerly looking forward to the appearance of this book. So Nancy, why don't you sign in and we will hear your discussion.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Maura and Matthew. Thank you, Curie, also for helping arrange this conference, and to the NYU Center for Ancient Studies. Thank you for including me. As David mentioned, this is still a nascent area of study for medieval Islamicists, and I feel very fortunate to be able to benefit from my colleagues who are more steeped in the study of emotion than I have been. I also feel very perfectly set up for this talk because of the two previous talks that we've already heard, particularly with concepts from Curie's talk about the universality of the inclination toward the good and the revulsion from the hateful or harmful, the concept of the self-cultivation or perfection of the self through the understanding and regulation of emotion. These are going to be central concepts for what I'll be talking about. And also thank you, Pia, for laying out the Aristotelian groundwork, particularly as articulated in the rhetoric, which David also just reminded us of. This will all be relevant to the discussion of emotion in the Islamic philosophical tradition. So some caveats to begin, and then I'll sort of lay out what the structure of the talk is. I don't have slides, and so you'll see me reading my paper as if we were at a regular conference. The structure of this conference is before emotion, which, as we've heard, signals not so much that emotions were not present in the past, but that emotional repertoires and conceptions varied and were considered differently in a variety of pre-modern contexts. So I approached the conceptualization of this conference by asking another question. Where is emotion in the Arabic Islamic tradition? And as you might imagine, much to both my delight and my dismay, the answer is everywhere. We could consider, for example, the emotional dimensions of scripture, of ritual, of edifying stories. We could consider the literary and poetic tradition. We could consider the emotion or passion involved in sectarianism, in salvific historical writing, or in mystical texts. We could look at how emotion features in pious devotional activity. We could even look at emotion in texts on medicine and healing, particularly psychological treatises. So the possibilities really are endless in the Arabic tradition. Our texts are numerous and quite vast. And in less than 30 minutes, I plan to simply broach the subject in some areas, gesture toward others, and then conclude with an argument about how emotions and the formation of the self were manipulated and directed in what I think of as the pietistic tradition literature. Namely, I'll be thinking or talking about a subgenre of reports called hadith, which are sayings by or about the Prophet Muhammad. And this subgenre is generally labeled exhortation and dissuasion, or in Arabic, targhib wa tarhib. These traditions are sayings that are alternatively edifying or terrifying. They're popular, meaning that they're not used for the derivation of law necessarily. They're not always considered authentic, but they're popular and they circulate widely. They feature in public sermons, and they circulated for centuries, beginning around the 8th or 9th, and were eventually compiled in the 13th century in an iconic collection called the Book of Exhortation and Dissuasion, put together by an Egyptian scholar named Al-Mundhiri, who dies in 1258. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is situate this genre of tradition literature on exhortation and dissuasion by thinking about the paradigm of exhorting or discouraging in both Quranic discourse and in Arabic ethical and philosophical discourse. Basically, I found this idea of exhorting and dissuading, making people hope for things and making them fear for things, sort of easy to understand on its face, but in a desire not to be anachronistic and assume that I understood what those concepts really meant, I wanted to understand how people thought about exhortation and dissuasion, how they understood hope and fear to work in the contexts in which these traditions circulated. So of course, it's important to consider the emotional vocabulary, the numerous Arabic terms that can connote specific emotion concepts like anger or love, ghadab and hubb, or the concept of passion in Sufi or mystical contexts. The word usually we hear is ishq. Or we could think about the general plural word ihsas, corresponding to sensations, and can refer to either bodily sensation or sensory perception. And when I do discuss certain emotions in the Quran, I will be going over some ubiquitous emotion words, particularly those pertaining to hope and fear. For a general overview of emotion in the Quran, I would refer the audience to the work of Karen Bauer, who has talked about emotion plots in scripture. But in the interest of time, I just want to note that I'm going to have to leave aside for today complex philological discussions, but also discussions of emotion in Sufism, as well as in literature and poetry. And I'll be focusing specifically on the structure that I'll describe now. First, I'll talk about words and contexts in which hope and fear are evoked in the Quran, so roughly in the 7th, 8th century kind of discourse. And then I'll describe the broad contours of how emotions were regarded in the slightly later medieval Arabic ethical and philosophical tradition from the 8th to the 11th century, and then round out the talk with my thoughts about this later pietistic tradition of exhortation and dissuasion. Not to say that the material of that tradition is later, but I'll be thinking about it in its 13th century context, trying to understand how through a philosophical discourse and through centuries of engagement with the concepts of hope and fear, how those traditions may have resonated. So the selection of these domains was not random, because these three strains that I'm looking at, scripture, ethics, popular piety, overlapped, or rather they were braided together in different ways in the period spanning these centuries. So the earliest Islamic liturgical text that we have is the Quran. And so this concept of targhib and tarhib, exhortation and dissuasion, encouragement and discouragement in the Quran, really is based upon a matrix of hope and fear. The range of Quranic terms that could be translated as fear, and to a lesser extent, the words that we'll see for hope, has several dimensions. And not all of them are related to the concept of discouragement, which is predicated on anticipatory fear. And the word for that we find is khawf, K-H-A-W-F. The meanings of khawf and its corollary, its hopeful corollary, raja, are explicated in ethical and theological treatises that we'll talk about in section 2 of this paper in terms of temporality. They indicate a state of expectation or anticipation. In the Quran, khawf and related derived terms occur in verses describing the anticipation of a negative or undesirable outcome, or with fearful suspicion about something that has not yet happened. So it's not sort of fear of a bear, it's fear of the impending bear. Otherwise, khawf appears in verses that reassure believers not to fear an outcome from which they might be protected by God, either through providence or mercy. But in nearly all cases, in the Quran, khawf is used to describe a state of anticipation of future judgment, whether of people for themselves or of prophets on behalf of others. An iconic example is Quran 55:46, and whoever is in fear of standing before the Lord, etc., etc., etc. The same phrase about standing before God occurs in other verses as well. So in addition to fears forecast into an eschatological future, anticipation of negative outcomes in this life are also cast as khawf. Fear of imminent danger appears as khawf in Quran 20:21, and at other times it is simply negated with the Arabic word la to reassure a believer that an anticipated bad outcome in this life will not occur and that they are among the righteous. Again, suspicion or anxiety, also future directed, is expressed in verses about the misgivings and motives of others, or dread about something that is expected but as yet unrealized. Rather typically, hope, the companion of fear, is generally defined in ethical treatises as the anticipation of a good outcome. And while fear may be directed at anticipated events in this world and the next, when it comes to hope, in the Quran, it is exclusively eschatological and is always paired or often paired with the idea of liqa, or meeting God. The word amal, a more colloquial term for hope, is used in the Quran, but only to describe false or vain hopes. The root of raja indicates the expectation of reward or mercy, and implicit in the word is the concept of a desired outcome, again, or a sense of potential or promise. It can also refer to a desire to meet God or looking forward to meeting with God on the day of judgment. Fear and aspiration can also appear together. They're not necessarily opposites. In the words khawfan wa tam'an, as in Quran 13:12 and again in 30:24. The word tama for aspiration has a sense of longing, as in verses 26:51 and 26:82, describing a longing for forgiveness or reward. Unlike raja, the previous word for hope, tama is occasionally more explicitly a matter of being covetous or desirous or eager for something. And that emotion can be related to earthly desires as well. So that's what we find in the Quran. Targhib and tarhib, discouragement and encouragement, or rather encouragement and discouragement, correspond to these anticipatory types of hope and fear that we find in the Quranic terms raja and khawf. The roots of the words for exhortation and dissuasion, they occur together in a verse on the story of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, and his wife, describing their longing for a child in adverbial forms that may be translated as hopefully and fearfully. And this has to do with when Zechariah calls to his Lord and says, "Do not leave me alone with no heir." And so God responds, "We gave to him John. Indeed, they," meaning Zechariah and his wife, "used to hasten to good deeds and supplicate us in hope, raghban, and fear, rahban." So you see the roots of targhib, tarhib. And they were to us humbly submissive. This is Quran 21:89. So that's where we find a connection between anticipatory hope and fear and the terms targhib and tarhib in the Quranic text. When it comes to emotion in the ethical tradition, it remains to be seen how these concepts were understood in other domains aside from the Quran. A fundamental starting point for discussions of emotion in general in Arabic philosophical tradition is the correspondence between it and its indebtedness to the Greek philosophical tradition, from which some overarching principles remain, namely that the attainment of happiness is the ultimate goal of human life. And we find that transplanted into numerous Arabic discussions of the same goal, which is then eventually developed in light of the Quranic and prophetic tradition within domains of intellectual and social activity in which it's the attainment of salvation and God's pleasure that is the desired end, because those are the things that will give the human being the ultimate happiness. The second through line that we see, I would say, borrowed pretty strictly and clearly from the Greek tradition, but resonating with other emotion traditions, as we saw from Curie's talk, is the idea of emotions as a mixture of pleasure and pain. And in fact, perhaps as pleasure and pain as the defining principles behind emotion states. So the emotive system in which hope and fear are discussed in medieval Islamic sciences is first developed within the domain of ethics. But what is Islamic ethics? Unfortunately, the answer is not simple or particularly easy to summarize, since Islamic ethics can be, in the words of one scholar, as diverse as the spectrum of ethical systems or the various interpretations of Islam itself. One long-standing view currently undergoing revision is that philosophy and theology represented two opposing understandings or approaches to ethics, with philosophy continuing the Greco-Arabic philosophical tradition, whereas theology would draw upon the Quran or traditions of the Prophet and Islamic religious law. This neat bifurcation, which is occasionally cast as being between rationalists and traditionalists, is less compelling given the philosophical and dialectical structure of argumentation employed by theologians, especially after the great Ghazali, who dies in the year 1111. So basically what I'd like to point out at this point is that in a lot of scholarship on philosophy versus Islamic tradition, or how philosophy interacted with Islamic tradition, there's a sense of a bifurcation between the inheritance of the rationalistic Greek tradition and the Quran or tradition-based Islamic ethos. And what I'm suggesting instead, as some others are now also doing or have been doing for a while actually, is that the two things overlap a lot more than originally considered. So that bifurcation, which has been cast as between rationalists and traditionalists, doesn't really obtain when we think about how emotions are understood and discussed in a variety of literatures. Now, it's true that there were three main influences on early Islamic ethical tradition: Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. And three main themes that emerged: therapies for the soul, virtue ethics, and eudaimonism, what constitutes the happy life. When it comes to therapies for the soul, the earliest writings that we have come from a circle of Christian philosophers who were inheriting the Greco-Roman tradition, namely starting with Al-Kindi in the 9th century, whose earliest ethical writings include a treatise on the means of dispelling sorrow, highly influenced by Galen. Other prominent figures in the genre of ethics and what we might call psychological therapy were his student Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, as well as Abu Bakr al-Razi, both the former being a 10th century figure. Al-Razi also dies in the year 925. Al-Balkhi expanded on the theme of dispelling afflictions, including not only sorrow, but also anger, envy, fear, melancholy, and suspicion. So did Abu Bakr al-Razi, who was also a physician and wrote a work entitled Spiritual Medicine, which has a strong tendency toward asceticism and curbing the passions. Now, when it comes to virtue ethics and the pursuit of the happy life, the maintenance of virtue or psychological health is obviously a central theme in Islamic philosophy, incorporating Aristotelian definitions of virtue, as well as Aristotelian psychology, identifying the human person with an immaterial intellect, which provides the foundation for virtually all the discussion of the virtues in Islamic ethical texts up into the 13th century. Now, all of these questions about the attaining perfection or perfecting one's theoretical intellect could be deemed moral psychological ones, but they connect to questions of the role of emotion in the ancient sense of motive, or a desire for, or an inclination toward particular actions. So it's within the realm of ethical discussions of the inclination toward the good and the corresponding aversion from the evil, that discussions of emotive ethics and hope and fear as the basis of action are rooted. So as with certain valences of the word for hope in the Quran, raja, hope is cast again as the expectation of future good, joy, or benefit, while fear is the expectation or suspicion of a future evil, sorrow, or harm. Throughout the 10th to 12th centuries, philosophers, theologians, Sufis, and legal theorists all developed nuanced theories of action based on this premise, but they each did so through a highly specialized discourse to arrive at differently inflected theories of what the felicitous life was and how it could be achieved. So in sum, philosophy, early Arabic philosophy, continued in the Greco-Arabic philosophical tradition, and ethical systems of philosophy, virtue ethics, and eudaimonistic theories are found not just in Arabic translations of works like Plato's Republic or in the Nicomachean Ethics or in the thought of the Stoics, but we also find Stoic-inspired therapies of the soul. We find ethical debates focusing on what a virtue is and what constitutes human happiness, and whether such happiness is attained in this world or in the hereafter. And we can trace the line of that work through the 9th century Al-Kindi, through an ethicist named Miskawayh, who wrote a very influential book on the refinement of character. We find this discourse also in the philosophical works of Al-Farabi in the 10th century, Avicenna in the 11th century, the aforementioned Al-Ghazali, and most importantly, in a kind of a culmination of philosophical and theological discussion in the 13th century in the work of another Al-Razi, this time Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. The 13th century is also when al-Mundiri compiled those traditions on exhortation and dissuasion. And so when I think about the way those traditions might have resonated in the 13th century, it's by looking at it through this development of thought about the emotions, hope and fear in particular, as articulated in all of these different discourses over time. And by the 13th century, it's the philosophically inspired theologian, so this time there is no bifurcation between philosophy and theology. By the time we get to a Fakhr al-Din al-Razi in the 13th century, we have what one scholar has called the most thoroughgoing Islamic consequentialism, based on a perfectionist theory of pleasure. Al-Razi endorses a utilitarian view that all human actions are directed toward the attainment of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So in the 13th century CE, we're basically back to Aristotle, but through this enormous amount of discourse that changes how people place the importance of that paradigm when it comes to following something like religious law. So translating this complicated and sort of genealogically very deep ethical system into a popular idiom, however, was not the work of theologians or philosophers. Al-Farabi, the philosopher, Avicenna, the great doctor and philosopher, all acknowledged that so-called common people were not equipped to understand the complexities of these philosophical discussions about emotion or about anything else. But translating that ethical system into a popular idiom was the work of preachers and traditionists who circulated those exhortation and dissuasion traditions to communicate systems of values to everyday believers in a language of emotion that was articulated through this Quranic exhortation dissuasion paradigm, rather than in the vocabulary of moral psychology or even of ethics. Instilling emotions like hope and fear through anecdotes that either encouraged or discouraged people, that inspired or intimidated them, was the goal of the exhortation and dissuasion tradition. But given the end of that goal, the attainment of eschatological happiness and the avoidance of divine punishment, it is impossible to read exhortation and dissuasion literature, popular as it was, without hearing in it echoes of the ethical paradigms I've been discussing for the majority of this talk. After a thinker like Al-Ghazali in the 1111 to the early 12th century, and for Fakhruddin al-Razi in the 13th, as I noted, these two originally separate discourses on piety or Quranic understandings of emotion and philosophical and ethical discussions of emotion have merged. And traditionalists who relate edifying tales or terrifying anecdotes are working within a tradition of ethical cultivation, even if their understanding of philosophical concepts on the nature of emotion came second or third hand, which indeed I think they probably did. And I'm thinking here of one of the most famous preachers in 13th century Egypt, a contemporary of al-Mundhiri, the person who compiled the traditions, named Ibn al-Jawzi, who dies in 1208 and whom I'll describe in a bit. So the popular register for an elite ethical discourse is akin to what historian Peter Brown once observed about the tradition of Islamic edeb, or paideia, the novelty of which he described in terms of its application to men of the world rather than its religious content, its adoption in the everyday world of non-ascetics that was nevertheless capable of transforming all believers, not just those who had withdrawn from society to give themselves over to an alternative paideia, for him in his context of the celibate monastery, or in the medieval Islamic context of elite philosophical or theological discourse. So Ibn al-Jawzi, this 13th century rather famous preacher and hadith scholar, wrote a manual on how to give a good sermon, or basically a book describing those who gave and delivered sermons. And the argument that I'd like to put forward is that popular practices led to a kind of pious subject formation, resonating with aspects of both the philosophical and traditionalist approaches to ethics that I've described. Again, these are popular, non-legal, emotional traditions, rhetorically inflected. And Ibn al-Jawzi spends a lot of time in his manual on preaching, talking about balancing hope and fear in the audience. I should also say that we could talk in the Q&A about the influence of Aristotle's rhetoric on public preaching, which is another part of the argument that I'd like to make, but I may not be able to engage with it directly in the course of this talk. So the engagement of traditionalists with issues of motivation for action has tended to be dismissed by scholars who study ethics, which is strange. In one example, John McGuinness has stated, quote, whereas philosophers approached issues of morality from the stance of virtue ethics, theologians and lawyers most frequently approached ethics from the stance of deontology, considering only duty or obligation. Thus, for theologians and lawyers, ethics was less about forming moral character than it was about following the law, basically. But I'd argue that what this exhortation and dissuasion tradition demonstrates is that the formation of moral character was very much connected to how people felt about which actions were considered morally commendable and detestable. And that's true even if the moral character and its conditioning is not concerned with what's obligatory or permissible by Islamic law, because these traditions had to do with voluntary actions, things that would cultivate a disposition of piety or a habit of piety, even if they didn't incur punishment for being forbidden. When we consider the exhortation and dissuasion tradition from the perspective of these other discourses on the nature of hope and fear, or the inclination toward the good and the aversion from the evil, and consider them factors in ethical cultivation, we can see how the philosophical, ethical, and traditionalist domains were not at all mutually exclusive. So the terms targhib and tarhib, and this is me getting to my conclusion, while they contain complex meanings, as did the terms that we saw in the Quran, I have tended to translate them as exhortation and dissuasion. But from that, I want us to understand that what those words imply is inspiration towards certain things and discouragement away from others. So it's clear that hope and fear, targhib and tarhib, are not opposite terms, but form a conceptual dyad. Implicit in encouragement is the notion of spurring people to action that will increase or bring expected or hoped for benefits or rewards. While in tarhib, we find admonishment away from acts that will bring a believer harm or pain. The underlying emotional object is always based on that pleasure or pain principle, is always one of hope and fear, hope for God's reward and approval, and intimidation away from its opposite. The future expectation of punishment or reward underlies all aspects of the themes and subjects of popular tradition in exhortation and dissuasion reports. Furthermore, this genre of tradition is about more than just what's legal and is more than about what's governed by law or obligation. It's not just deontological. It covers obligatory acts, but it also talks about family relations, voluntary acts like giving more charity than is required, extra fasting, additional prayers, and matters of daily comportment. So hope and fear were both the instruments and the end results of targhib and tarhib. The stories were hopeful and fearful, and they also inspired hope and fear in those who listened. The dyad of hope in the Quran, we saw raja, and fear, khawf, that underlies that paradigm is obviously related to paired concepts in the philosophical and ethical tradition, such as the ascertainment of the good, the husn, and the evil, qubh, the anticipation or experience of pleasure, ladha or surur, or the experience and anticipation of pain, alam or gham, the reaping of benefit or advantage. In legal theory, the words are maslaha or nafr, or the avoidance of harm, mafsada. And then there are other pairs that feature in legal theoretical works, such as cultivating the inclination towards something that is liked by God, mahbub, and instilling revulsion away from that which is disliked, makruh. Further, though Al-Mundhiri's compendium of hadith traditions on exhortation and dissuasion had a long history as a subgenre in the hadith tradition, any effort to discern how those traditions helped comprise a particular emotion culture in the 13th century, in which hope and fear were constantly evoked, requires an explanation of how those emotions had been conceptualized and in which domains of thought they received attention. So, to my mind, popular targhib and tarhib functioned as a kind of companion genre at the popular level of more esoteric scholarly treatises on the nature of hope and fear across a range of disciplines. In my current research, my aim is to understand the emotion culture at work in these traditions, to connect it with a temporally specific intellectual and textual milieu. And while it's impossible to reconstruct a multifaceted discourse in all its complexity, and from several specialized perspectives at once, we can point to emblematic theological, ethical, and legal theoretical works to draw broad strokes around the concepts of hope and fear in the work of several of Al-Mundhiri's contemporaries or near contemporaries in this era. I've already mentioned theologian Fakhruddin al-Razi, who dies in 1209. I will also gesture here towards the jurist al-Sulami, who dies in 1263, who established that the acquisition of benefit and avoidance of harm was the sine qua non of all Sharia legislation. I've also mentioned the preacher Ibn al-Jawzi, who wrote a treatise explaining how to balance hope and fear in public preaching, and who also incidentally wrote an abridgment of the massively influential work of al-Ghazali, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, which then received an abridgment to the abridgment in Ibn al-Jawzi's day by a scholar named Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, not to be confused with the famous relative of a similar name in an earlier generation. So in this iterative but always evolving tradition, the dual themes of happiness and sorrow, benefit and harm, hope and fear are addressed in different ways. Rather than seeing a separation or bifurcation then between rationalism and traditionalism, or between philosophical and religious sciences, I would argue that attention to emotionality and to the different but related domains in which ethical cultivation hinged on theorizing about and balancing between emotion concepts like hope and fear, reminds us of the interdisciplinarity and interdependence of all of these medieval Islamic religious sciences. Thank you.
We've come to the end of our session, and I want to thank, of course, I want to thank the speakers for a series of wonderful presentations that have been interlinking with each other in exciting ways and will produce the occasion for much more thinking. I also want to thank all the participants, those who actively presented questions on the Q&A and those who listened and will perhaps have more comments to make in the future. Remind you all that tomorrow, again at noon in Eastern Time and the corresponding hours elsewhere, we will have 3 more presentations on ancient India, on ancient Hebrew terminology, and on Rome, and that you are invited to come, and the structure will be very much the same. So I say thank you to all, and have a good evening, whatever time of day it is where you are, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Bye, everybody.